This is Judaism Unbound, episode 23. Hello Mazel.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
And we're here in part 2 of our 4-part series on emergent innovation, talking to a really interesting organization that is actually involved in 2 or at least 2 projects that we're especially interested in. The organization is called The Kitchen. It's what's generally called an emergent spiritual community out in the Bay Area. Those are basically these synagogue-like organizations led by a rabbi who are doing things a little bit differently, or quite a bit differently from the way synagogues are doing things. And the other project that this organization is involved with is called Hello Mazel, which we'll talk about more as the show goes on, but suffice it to say that it is the most highly funded Kickstarter campaign in the history of Jewish campaigns on Kickstarter by an order of 100%. So our guests today are Rabbi Noa Kushner, who is the founder of The Kitchen, and Yoav Schlesinger, who is the executive director of The Kitchen. Noa and Yoav, thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to have you on Judaism Unbound.
Thank you. Pleasure.
So, Noa, can you tell me a little bit about The Kitchen? What is it exactly, and when did it come about?
Kitchen started almost exactly 5 years ago because a group of us were looking for Shabbat that we couldn't find. And we began with creating Shabbatot. And eventually we added a family school. We added holidays. We added all kinds of opportunities to learn, experiential learning, high-level Torah learning. And now we're doing a great deal of work in organizing and direct service.
So how's The Kitchen evolved over time? Did you expect the rapid growth that you experienced, or was that something that surprised you?
You know, The Kitchen is, one of the ways we describe it is as a San Francisco experiment. And the premise was, could we get more Torah and more substance and more content to more people? Initially, we thought about removing barriers as a way to do that, perceived and real barriers. And I can talk a little bit about what we thought those were and have turned out to be. And once we were able to have real success with that, we started thinking more broadly, and we decided to go to IDEO, a global design firm, to bring to them this question: how do we bring more of this essentially rich content to more people in San Francisco and beyond in 2016? So initially, we thought, we think people in Gen X are looking for meaning. We think millennials are looking for meaning and substance, wanting to connect to issues of the day, social justice issues. We looked at the Pew studies, and they verified what I had suspected, which is in San Francisco in 2000, I believe it was 2004, was a 90% unaffiliation rate. And I just thought, what do we have to lose? Let's try some different things. What happens if we make it free, essentially, right? In the early days. What happens if we don't ask you about your descent? Anyone who wants to do Jewish can do Jewish. The premise is that if you're willing to roll up your sleeves and do something with sincerity and integrity, we want you there, right? So you can be technically not Jewish, as I say, not licensed, but driving well, right? You can be someone, we have in some of our materials, we'll say, like, you could be Moshe himself. You could be Moshe Rabbeinu, but if you're not willing to do anything, it's very little for us to do with you. So assuming you want to be in the room, we very much want to work with you. And so some of the barriers were around identity. Some of the barriers were around being able to pay, or financial realities. And some of the perceived barriers were also just culturally. We found that when we went into a lot of existing Jewish institutions, they weren't speaking the cultural language of Gen X and millennials. And so by making some tweaks around language, around branding, around the look and the feel of the location, around informality, we were able to signal to people in my generation and younger generations, this was created for you. And so we just got a huge response off of that for the first few years. Then I was fortunate enough to have Yoav join the team. And when we started playing around with these ideas of, well, we're reaching hundreds and hundreds of people, how do we reach more? How can we connect more people? And Another huge premise at the kitchen is that we don't choose between innovation or content. We don't choose between substance and access. For us, the answer is always it has to be both, right? So if we have this beautiful Torah and nobody can understand it and no one's relating to it, then we failed. And by the same token, if we're reaching a ton of people and there's no content that goes with it, there's no substance, we also failed. So by putting these things together, we thought, we really did think early on, do we want to grow services to get 1,000 people in the room? What's the goal? How are we going to reach more and more of these people? We looked around the landscape, we did our own brainstorming, and then really it was Yoav's idea to engage IDEO and speak with them about how we could indeed reach more people at a variety of levels and in a variety of ways. Before we went to IDEO, people would say, what does it look like? Like, what are you building? Where are you headed? And I used to say, I don't know where we're headed. I just know it doesn't look like that. Whatever is existing. After we left IDEO, I really did feel that we had an understanding of where it was we were headed. And we have something that we affectionately call the kitchen solar system. And the kitchen solar system operates on the principle that you have to have communal events. Like, that's a huge charge. And you need to have individual and personally driven experiences, right? So a lot of times I'll relate this to heart and the arteries, right? You need a big pumping heart in a healthy body. And in the Jewish world, it's generally a communal event. The problem is we've neglected all the arteries. We've neglected places where people can spontaneously create interesting experiences on their own and iterate on things, right? So what we tried to do is say, how can we help people? How can we seed these experiences so that people can do things on their own? And then eventually we'd like to see them in communal settings as well, when that's right for them. But these are two poles, but they have to exist together. I think if there's that Jewish person who's reading incredible Jewish books by themselves, never has anyone to talk to about it, we would agree that in the majority of cases, that experience is lacking. By the same token, if someone thinks they have to be in a communal setting in order to be Jewish and express their Jewishness, I think we can agree that that is also lacking, right? Unfortunately, the Jewish community has built itself around a series of communal experiences, and we've seen the atrophy of these individual experiences. So as opposed to building bigger and bigger communal experiences, which was certainly a legitimate path, early on we said, how can we make things happen for people in homes? How can we get people to want to do this on their own? How can we get them to be committed Jewishly without the rabbi in the room, right? It's not that we want to get rid of the rabbi. Rabbi needs a job. But at the same time, if they aren't able to go to a park and do Havdalah together or find a way into a Shabbat or something, reading something in addition to what they're doing with me and in the community, then I will think we've failed. So the kitchen, just to cap it off, and the kitchen solar system, if we are able to finance it and build it out, you would see, in addition to the communal things that we do, which include holidays across the city. So we'll typically build a sukkah for 200 people in Golden Gate Park, or we'll do a giant party in a mansion for Purim, or we'll have 1,000 people in a church for high holidays, and of course Shabbat across the city. In addition to that, you would also see Hello Mazel, and I'll let Yoav speak to that, and we'll get into that later. There might be pop-up retail. There might be a truck that goes where the farmer's truck goes. There's obviously be a web presence and a video presence and a brand and materials. And hopefully the voice behind all those materials and the person in the truck and the person at the pop-up store, these are all top-notch educators who can work in a variety of settings. That's key. We don't just want to build something cute. We really do want it to have substance, but we feel like there's a gateway. There's an opportunity to draw people in through a variety of different design elements.
So is it right to sort of see the kitchen as a type of synagogue for our times? And I guess I'm curious, like, as you think about how it's similar to or different from what our listeners might think of as a synagogue, what is the new need that it's serving, and how does it go about that? Or how did it originally, before you grew it in different ways, how did it originally sort of address the need that you were seeing in a way that Jewish institutions that were trying to serve similar kinds of needs or opportunities were not doing?
My father and my husband both work in synagogues. I think synagogues do incredible work. And I think a lot of what the kitchen does, in essence, has a ton of overlap with what synagogues do. I think we also have a lot of overlap with what Chabad does. We're definitely in the religious content providing sphere.
But we would never call ourselves a synagogue. We've played with what term we should use to describe ourselves, and it has ranged, depending on the day and our moods, from, startup shul to religious startup to a Jewish action tank. I mean, you can think of a variety of different things that we do. And so, like Noah said, while the what appears very much like a quote-unquote synagogue, the how and the why differ substantially enough for us to set ourselves, at least in our own self-conception, apart from a synagogue.
What is it that is the new need that you are trying to serve that called for a new kind of organization along the lines of what you built?
We've been very thoughtful about the fact that what we are providing, as Yoav said, you might find in many other Jewish areas. Hopefully you would find it with a certain kind of a kitchen feel to it. We like to think what we do is exceptional, but I think a lot of places would say that. But where we have done the most change and most innovative work is around our distribution system, how we give you that experience. So I always say, if you want something that's really a radical departure from, in my mind, normative Judaism, Berkeley is doing, the Aquarian Minyan has been around a lot longer and is doing things far more off the charts than we will ever do. We tend to shoot straight down the progressive middle in a lot of areas. But in terms of the distribution, I would say the first marker right away is that we are intentionally and incredibly porous. So really, a lot of places think they are, but in fact, most of the people who go are members or are loyalists in some way. At the kitchen, at any given time or experience, you could find 50% new people every single time. It would not be unusual. I would think the least amount of new people would be a third new people. And the way they are welcomed when they come and the treatment they receive is a big, big part of who we are. This was in response to the fact that we thought the biggest problem was not that this synagogue was broken or this Jewish agency was this or that. It really was more that when you look at the sheer numbers, if 90%, and I think that number has even gone up, are not connecting, drastic measures need to be taken and big experiments need to be run.
From what I've heard of my friends who are in the Bay Area, your experiment's doing pretty well. So I want to start with that. But I had another related question on the sort of what are we, who are we scheme. And that's the name of your organization. The Kitchen is a really interesting name. I won't say why I think it's interesting. I'll let you say why you think it's interesting. But what went into deciding the name, The Kitchen, and why that one as opposed to any number of other options?
I actually would pull the camera back and say, I went to a friend of my brother's who is a strategist and a designer, and I didn't know that those fields really existed. I'm a rabbi, and I asked him for a business card. And I didn't get the business card for 3 years, but he became my partner in all things strategy and design and taught me how to communicate with the world in a different way. And I would say, especially for organizations that don't own real estate, and the Kitchen does not have the intention of owning real estate, becomes that much more important. So we put a tremendous amount of energy into how we talk to people. Josh Levine and I sat down in the early days. I actually love Hebrew, but when I heard people talk about their congregations or Jewish agencies and they had Hebrew names, I mostly heard them mispronounce those names or abbreviate them. So B'nai Jeshurun, which is a beloved community, most people would call it BJ. Rodef Shalom could be Rodef. Sometimes Hebrew words are mangled. And it became clear to me just from hearing that those names didn't have any emotional significance for the people who were saying them. At the very least, it was a neutral or like, I'm going to try to get through this name without saying it improperly. I felt was a larger prism through which to look at the problem of religion. People are just trying to grin and bear it. That's not what we're going for. We don't want them to just not make a mistake. We want them to feel connected and comfortable. So we thought, what if there was a name that you could say it and would make you want to be there right away? And the kitchen was that kind of a conceptual place where people roll up their sleeves, they work together. The irony is that I don't cook. I'm a terrible cook. But we felt like meaningful conversations happen in the kitchen, and people want to be there when there's a party. And maybe most importantly, everyone has a kitchen. It's a little bit subversive.
I wanted to follow up on something you alluded to, which was this idea that you don't intend on owning any real estate, which has come up in a few of our discussions lately with other guests on our podcast. And I was wondering if you could expand on why, for the kitchen, it was the right call not to own any real estate, not to house yourselves in any one particular building.
So I think there's a very practical and pragmatic reason for that decision. The first and foremost is the cost of owning and maintaining a property in San Francisco in 2016 is enormous. We're talking on the order of millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. And we have always felt that if we were going to make that type of investment into religious life in San Francisco, that investment would be far better in human capital and in innovative projects to reach people instead of a building and or a container in which those people could gather. So that's first of all. Second of all, what happens by and large with the ownership of a container like that is a kind of malaise institutionally about innovating beyond that space and serving people outside of that container. So by virtue of not owning a building and not being in real estate, we are forced to consistently reinvent ourselves, to surprise ourselves and San Franciscans and Kitchenites broadly about where we might appear. So as Noah said, whether it's Purim in Chinatown or a sukkah in the Presidio, we're able to consistently find newness in the world rather than just hosting every event in our own social hall. And lastly, we find the intersection and interplay between secular and religious space to be a really interesting dynamic in San Francisco. So the creation of simply religious space is for a lot of people who might not find their way into a quote-unquote synagogue traditionally a turnoff. They have baggage when they enter the door of religious space. But by being in secular space, a space that is consciously not a synagogue, that is consciously not owned by the kitchen, we are consistently appearing in those secular spaces where people don't necessarily bring the same preconceived notions of the way they're meant to behave in that space and what they might expect to find in that space. So basically for those three reasons, and probably a few more that I could come up with, we are not in the real estate market.
The other piece, though, is that we work very hard. We spend a lot of capital and hours on finding the right space. So first of all, we have a very, very lean budget. If we had no budget, we could rent some pretty fantastic spaces. We have a really, really tight budget, but it has to still feel good to our people. It has to feel modern, and it has to feel like a kitchen. So I have been known to make everyone crazy by rejecting the first 20 places until we find the place that we think could evoke some sort of mixture of secular and holy and Jewish and welcoming and all the things that make us who we are.
Do you typically have services in one particular place, or do they move around?
We are really blessed because we have one space for Shabbat that we will often use. But even that, sometimes we can't use and we'll move around. But typically, we're meeting in the old Levi Strauss factory turned Quaker school in the Mission.
So I'm curious if you could now tell us a little bit more about that process of working with IDEO, because I'm fascinated by that. Essentially, if I'm understanding this correctly, the kitchen had been in existence for some time and doing quite well, I think. And then at a certain point, though, you decided to take it to the next level. And I'm curious why and how that came about. And then to specifically work with IDEO, which is a design consulting company. And I'm curious how that process came into play.
I personally have no problem learning from experts in whatever field, whether it's business, whether it's design, branding, etc. Originally, the idea for working with IDEO came from a conversation we were effectively having around knowing what direction to head, and frankly, not knowing even the questions to begin to ask. And I was familiar with IDEO's work in design research mostly, and thinking about their expertise in even formulating the questions that we should be asking of people. And so had this idea, and we were lucky enough to learn that a few of the people in the kitchen community were employees of IDEO, connected to IDEO in different ways. And so we navigated the interpersonal relationships and connections to find our way to a meeting with the chief creative officer, Paul Bennett, who was really interested in redesigning religion. A personal passion of his to think about redesigning religion. And I think he's also taken on a project to redesign the experience of death in working with the Zen Hospice Project and others. But this was interesting to him and certainly interesting to us. So we kind of presented them with the challenge of thinking about innovating the channels of delivery of religious content. That was our design brief to them, effectively. What can we do? How do we get more Torah to more people? And we engaged them in a 2-day workshop to think through just those things. And they brought a really high-powered, multi-faith team that they built on their end. And we brought our own people. And together we dreamed about what the world might look like if we were to reinvent Jewish delivery.
Even from the perspective of getting to engage with people who were not Jewish insiders on this and were not quote unquote users, but we're looking at it with some distance, and we're looking at it as people who had helped build many, many companies in the country. It was thrilling and very validating for us to be able to say, well, we've been thinking about, these series of questions, and for them to help us shape those questions.
I don't know if you've seen the Nightline episode about IDEO and how they redesigned the shopping cart, but we can link to that in our show notes for people who aren't familiar with IDEO. And if you have seen, I'm wondering, was the process very similar? I mean, I'm trying to picture the process, just how the process works of a 2-day meeting with the design company talking about how to redesign Judaism or redesign the delivery of religion.
I think in this moment where the Jewish landscape is so fluid and there are such massive existential questions that we are addressing like at every turn, it was helpful for us to say, okay, this is our frame. These are our constraints. And this is at least the direction we're going to be headed. Still don't know if we're going to be successful, but it gave us the courage to go in a direction.
IDEO has an incredible number of strengths, but one of the things that I found most beneficial about the process itself was the impetus to build and the prompt to build. So through an IDEO process, you're not allowed to just talk about ideas. You have to build your idea and show it. And so there has to be a real product in a way that you can share with the rest of the group and say, this is how this would work. Here's the prototype. This is how the experience will feel. This is what the app that we might build looks like. This is what this product is. And so it moves very quickly from the theoretical to the practical. And that arc really is not an arc that a lot of organizations, unfortunately, employ. Right? Spend a lot of time thinking about ideas, but it's not until you actually put pencil to paper that those ideas crystallize and take shape.
I'm sitting here wondering, is it only a kind of startup synagogue, new community that can do that? Is it the case that in a community of more long-standing that if you tried to say, oh, okay, now we're going to adopt an iterative process and we're going to adopt, we're going to do all these things, like would there be too much pushback from the community for saying, this is the way that we've always done it?
I basically would use really, really strong language around this And I would say if the community is going great and there's a general sense of trust and joy and transformation around what's happening, then I would say kol hakavod, like keep doing what you're doing. If the community is in crisis, like so many, then I think it's incumbent upon people to take some really big risks and to do things out of their comfort zone. I'm worried about the future of some of these communities. I don't say that with any joy. And I think a relatively easy solution is to create, let's call it a second brand within that community. I think this is a real opportunity for an established community to say, we actually generally like what's going on here, but we do want people under the age of X. So we're going to hire a team of people to create a different brand. It may happen off-site. Some of the places are doing this to great success. And it doesn't, in my mind, the idea that it's a zero-sum game, that if we bring in these new people, me, loyalist, I will somehow lose. I think that's the heart of the problem. So we have to expand the playing field. The one thing I would add is, and Yoav really has generated and executed and really dreamed up Hello Mazel from start to middle to wherever we are now, and deserves all the credit. The one thing I would say IDEO helped me is I understood where something like Hello Mazel would fit conceptually, right? So I was moving out of creative minyan, a prayer group, Shabbat, community. I knew that wasn't enough, but I was trying to figure out how to expand it further. And I began to understand that something like a Hello Mazel belonged on the map.
So just for the sake of introduction, I'll say a few things about Hello Mazel. Basically, at least in starting off, it was by an order of, I believe, over 100% the highest Jewish project ever funded on Kickstarter. I think you had about 1,500 people who signed up. I was trying to be the last one, and I ended up as the second to last. But anyway, I think it was about 1,500 people that bought it, and I'm wondering, as we're recording this, in just a few weeks, the second Hello Mazel box is going to go out, and I'm curious how many more people have signed up since then. But essentially, what Hello Mazel is, I guess you should describe it, and then I'm curious if you could talk about how it fits in, and what is it that you think it's trying to achieve, or what are you trying to achieve with it, and also whether you think it ended up achieving something different, or it's on the path to, doing things that you didn't even dream of.
Hello Mazel is a quarterly box, or roughly quarterly box, of the best Jewish stuff we can find. And some of it not Jewish stuff, that we will imbue with Jewish content because we think that it could be relevant or appealing. So we're calling quarterly, but really we're meant to sort of follow the cycle of the Jewish calendar. We sent our first box for Pesach, Passover. We'll be doing a summer box, then a fall Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot version of a box, and then a Hanukkah box. So it's a little truncated schedule rather than exactly quarterly. The goal is really to deliver great Jewish content to people, right? We're not particularly interested in just being a box of food or a box of stuff, because lots of people could do that, but Hello Mazel is born from the kitchen. So that means we have a particular mission in mind, which is to help people find inroads and pathways to doing something Jewish. And that could look like a variety of different things. It need not be prayer. It need not be a particular holiday celebration. It could be any kinds of things. And our hope is that the inspiration we deliver through merchandise and commerce through Hello Mazel might inspire people in a way that they wouldn't otherwise be inspired. And so we're reaching a different demographic of people than are your traditional synagogue goers. We are taking a different approach to the question and the answer, which is how do we do Jewish in our existing networks, in our homes, with our families, with our friends, etc. My perspective has been oftentimes Jewish institutions and organizations demand effectively that you check your network at the door and plug into this other network that you will find inside, right? Forget all your friends and family there. Come and be with us and be in community here. And the reality is that's not how people engage today. They have these networks, and wouldn't it be great to be able to deliver something to someone for their use at their own cocktail party that has a Jewish bent to it, or that they'll take with them camping and it has some unique Jewishness to it, or to the beach, or to their grandparents' house for a visit, or all these other places where Judaism has something to offer them.
For our listeners, can you give some examples of what was in, let's say, the Passover box, since that one's out already, just to get a sense of what that best Jewish stuff that you could find is?
Yeah, so for the Passover box, we did a couple of things. First, we created a playable Haggadah. So one of the constraints around hosting a Seder for a lot of people is that you need multiple Haggadahs to use for all the participants at your table. And we created a playable version of the Haggadah that's a distributed deck of cards that involves everyone actively in the rituals of the Seder, as well as conversation, prompts for action, and really a reinvention of the Seder ritual itself. We also found a Jewish Israeli designer who's part of the kitchen community to redesign the Seder plate and reconceptualize the Seder plate, recognizing that the design constraints there are oftentimes Seder plates are heavy and expensive, and we have a box to put it in. So how could we reinvent the Seder plate? And she reinvented it essentially as a letterpress constructible Seder plate that people could use in a one-off or multiple locations and turn any flat surface into a Seder plate. We also then created a new ritual for people where we suggested that they, kind of like a Kabbalah thread, but green in this case instead of red, tie a green thread around their wrist for the time between Passover and Shavuot to mark that transition and that time period, and to be a remembrance of people who are currently not free, playing on the theme of liberation and freedom for Passover. And then we included 3 food items. The quintessential Passover food, macaroons, but found the best macaroon we possibly could, made by this guy Dan Cohen out in Brooklyn, and they are supremely awesome macaroons. We played on the notion of saltwater by putting saltwater taffy into the box and finding a great saltwater taffy maker. And then lastly, playing on a third taste of Passover, bitterness. And instead of including horseradish, which would have been the obvious solution to that, put coffee. And thinking about both the connection between the Maxwell House Haggadah and coffee and Passover and their tight connection, but also taking a food item like coffee that can be very bitter and elevating it and making it delicious at the same time. So the confluence of bitterness and sweetness in a way. And so that was the Passover box, kind of a ritual and food-based approach to celebration of the holiday.
At our Seder, my mom got a Hello Mazel box, and the best part was the drink card in the deck of cards that you just get to play at some point and everybody drinks. We use that one heavily in addition to our 4 cups, and it was a strong move. It was a good decision.
I think it really inspired us to be creative with our own stuff in a way that we might not have if we hadn't gotten the box of stuff that you or other people were inspired to do. So this year, for example, like we've never done this before, but I bought a costume, a pharaoh hat, wore it at the Seder. You know, we didn't really go into the depth of it. I mean, I actually wanted, in my mind, we were going to explore the possibility that we've become the pharaoh, something like that, but maybe next year. I was really especially fascinated, though, when I opened my Hello Mazel box. Some of the stuff was great, and I was, partly because of the advertising, you know, I was kind of expecting a new kind of Seder plate and a new kind of Haggadah. What I was not expecting was a new ritual. And for me, that has been one of the most significant things of Hello Mazel. It's funny, it's just a green piece of string that you're supposed to tie around your wrist. But actually, and it's funny too, because my wife and I both tied it around our wrist and are still wearing it. But we have a very different point of view on it. Every time I look at it, I feel happy because I'm like, oh, it's so cool. Somebody invented a new Jewish ritual. And when my wife looks at it, she feels really sad because she thinks of people that are in slavery. So I think she's got the right reaction, actually. But I'm curious, was there actually an intentional and long process of designing that, or did that sort of kind of come to somebody in a dream?
Look, the larger frame of anything in that box is that it's going to surprise you and catch your attention and prompt you to do something, right? And we're not going to dictate what the ultimate response would be, but we're really interested in engaging people on a variety of levels. For some people, that comes through taste. For some people, it's a real brain activity. For some people, it's an emotive activity. But mostly, we're trying to catch people's attention with this series of prompts. And you'll notice that, as Yoav said, everything in the box, it's not a series of religious items or ritual items in the box. It's things that are blending the secular and the religious together, which is very much our mind frame, which is that you shouldn't just be religious in a specific space and a specific time, but you should be able to take these ideas around justice and meaning and blessing out into the world. So the idea of the bracelet came from this idea of some kind of a reminder. And I have a friend, Rabbi Lori Phillips, who will tie a tzitzit on her wrist. She doesn't wear fringes under her clothes, but she'll wear one on her wrist. Serves the same function as a reminder to do good in the world. I wanted to see something that was particularly around justice, specifically for this box, because of the nature of the time of year and because of Pesach, because of Passover, and sort of combine them in my head and in our heads around, is there something people could wear? Could it be connected to making this holiday not just about celebration and family and our own freedom, but about the freedom of others?
I'm thinking about two aspects now. One is the home, and the other is the body as new locations for Jewish life. Now, of course, they're not new, but like I think you were saying earlier, that at least in America, it seems that the idea was in many cases for Jewish life to either take place in a public setting like a synagogue, with larger scale events, or in the home, but in the home in a very small way, with the family for Shabbat dinner. But in a way, I think that what Hello Mazel has the potential or is doing, what something like Moshe House is doing, what an organization like Keva, which has Jewish learning in people's homes, are in a way turning the home into a setting for communal Jewish life in a way that I'm not aware of having really happened before. And, the green string from Hello Mazel sort of, to me, is starting to represent another possibility that I hadn't really considered much before, which is that your body itself could become a place where Jewish life is more sort of profoundly attached. Now, of course, in the traditional world, that's been the case for a long time, we were talking about earlier with fringes worn under the clothing, but a lot of, let's say, non-observant Jews don't do that for various reasons. And it's just interesting, and I haven't seen it before, other ways of, new approaches to making the body a place that can really be a place of Jewish experience, let's say.
I think that it's a really interesting observation, Dan, and I think it's right in the sense that one of our key interests is filling out the space between those polarities, right, of communal versus personal, and thinking about the seamless interplay between them and carrying one to the other and vice versa. And so, as you navigate your daily life as a human being, you move in space and in time, and eating is a way of doing that. Being with other people is a way of doing that. Wearing symbols is a way of doing that. They're all avenues into that key thing we're trying to do, which is get people to think about doing Jewish.
We certainly are standing on the shoulders of the Chavurah movement, right? Because they used homes, I think, to great effect. And I think you saw some, I'd have to look in my history books, but I even think if we go to the new Jewish catalog books, what you saw there was a real DIY culture that was mimicking what was happening in the 70s, and real excitement around that. I think what we're adding in this time and building from their success is, with the internet, there's just many, many, many more possibilities, including spontaneity. And I remember distinctly a pivotal, at least for me, conversation around Hello Mazel, where we said, we were interviewing quite a few people who we thought would potentially be people who would want to take this and run with it. And we thought, okay, so the ultimate goal, the ultimate moment of success would be that person who gets the box and is like, you know what, you're right. It's Hanukkah in 2 days. I think I'm going to have a Hanukkah party. And she starts calling her boyfriend and her roommate and the guy down the hall because now she's inspired. She has enough prompts to put something together. Or I think I'm going to go out to the beach and I'm going to bring this booklet about blessing and I'm going to talk about blessings on the beach, right? And I'm going to have this kit that makes me feel empowered or makes me feel excited about doing something. So it's that spontaneity. It's critical because we don't plan to be close to God in weekly increments.
So I guess as a conclusion, as you look towards the future of the kitchen, of the Jewish community, are there places where, you haven't gotten to yet that you think are particularly important and exciting that sort of represent perhaps where your next move is or where you think others might labor fruitfully?
One of the how might we's that we formulated at IDEO was how might we become the Apple of religion, talking about Apple computers. And to me, there's a really interesting place for creating that sort of iconic sense of Jewish life that really people love, that they are incredibly passionate about, that they are excited by the new release of the next thing. And for the kitchen, I think the horizon looks like the continual innovation around those iconic moments and expressions and products of Jewishness that continue to hit people in that incredibly visceral way that they feel it in their kishkas and can't wait for the next thing. And if we just rest on our laurels and say, well, what we've done so far is good enough, we'll get stuck behind and become increasingly irrelevant over time because the innovation we came up with in 2015, 2016 is no longer relevant in 2020 and 2025.
And I would add to that, I'm interested in seeing the realization of this kitchen solar system. I always joke that I don't want to take over the world, just San Francisco. And I feel like if we had the funding to bring enough talented teachers of Torah together, rabbis and educators, we could create a variety of compelling settings whereby they would be meeting many, many, many thousands and thousands of these people, developing relationships with them and creating opportunities for them to engage with the tradition in meaningful ways. The only thing that's standing in our way right now, it's not the vision, it's not the culture, it's not the enthusiasm of the participants, it's just simply our size. And so if you ask me what's the future, I would say on one foot, hopefully more of the same, a lot more of the same.
Well, it's exciting. It reminds me of when I first got the first iPhone, and I remember, I would show it to people, and they would play with it for a few minutes, and they would be so excited about it, and then they'd give it back to me, and I would say, imagine if people felt this way about Judaism. So I hope you've got us on the right track. We're so grateful that you were with us today. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It was a total pleasure.
Thanks again to Rabbi Noa Kushner and to Yoav Schlesinger for coming on the show. Last but not least, we always want to close out our show by letting you know how you can be in touch with us. There are a few ways. One is through our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Another is by going to our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@nextjewishfuture.org or lex@nextjewishfuture.org. And if you're particularly curious about The Kitchen, you can check out their website at thekitchensf.org or Hello Mazel by going to hellomazel.com. So thanks again for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.